some of the, let's be honest, pretty remarkable experiences that you've had in industrial cybersecurity. I think, one of the most fascinating elements of that is your work in assisting the Ukrainian response to cyber attacks on their critical infrastructure. I think it'd be awesome if you could just share a little bit around sort of what your role was there, and I guess, some of what you witnessed and how that kind of influences your thinking on, cyber defense in sort of OT today.
Yeah, and I think, a lot of this is lucky timing. I think it's kind of important to point out that at least in the US, industrial security, the security community that we refer to as a collective people, the defenders of critical infrastructure, it's fairly well established. I mean, some of the early work started circa 2003, a little bit before then, but that was kind of the first times that it really became an operational security field focused on cyber physical systems, focused on this different aspects of operational technology. But the nice thing about starting a large portion of that part of my career at Idaho National Laboratory is I was able to really stand on the shoulders of giants. So I really got a fast track there. And I think that kind of matters too. And it does tie into the Ukraine piece, because I think the irony of the situation is that Idaho National Laboratory and the people I worked with were really forward looking with regards to the threat actors and could see kind of the writing on the wall, where they were going in terms of the capabilities, where they were intending to have effects. And it was really quite difficult to get people to listen to us, to say that this wasn't a Chicken Little situation where it wasn't fear, uncertainty, and doubt, but that people really could hack these systems. And that's kind of the irony of all of this. So when the first Ukrainian attack occurred in December 2015, the one that everybody kind of vividly remembers, at that time, it was really a watershed moment, because we no longer had to make the case for the fact that the electric grid could be attacked. And so there were several of us that could finally just use that as a basis for the conversation moving forward. In the first stages of the response, so that happened on the 23rd of December, 2015. In early January 2016, there was a multi-government agency from the US that went over. Representatives from the Department of Energy were there. Many of my colleagues, Department of Homeland Security representatives, some of my current colleagues were there. And they were really on a cyber forensics collection mission. They were there to talk to the individuals that witnessed the attack, to gather the artifacts from the event, to capture or collect any logs or other details that were salvageable, and then try and figure out what the next steps were. And that's really where I actually served in more reach back support in that space, and served as like the point person for developing the post-event analysis and ultimately the attribution statements associated with that. That experience, that the data we collected from that first trip served as a basis for follow-on engagements, including a Department of Energy focused activity in 2016 to work with a number of the energy sector elements in Ukraine to try and boost their defenses. And so we hosted a tabletop exercise and walked through a lot of the mechanics of the attack for a lot of different organizations that weren't primary victims in that first event. The goal, of course, was to try and protect from future attacks, which obviously occurred, unfortunately, somewhat effectively in December of that year as well. So in December of 2016, there was a follow-on event at the transmission level, and the cycle continues. So the engagement has continued on and off. Obviously, right now there's kind of a different shift in focus given the nature of kinetic warfare. It's hard to protect digital systems if they are having physical disruptions. So things are not the same in terms of the primacy of the focus, but still an ongoing mission for sure.
One of the elements of your work, which I think is really interesting as well, is the work that you've done in terms of that sort of predictive adversary analysis and threat intelligence. I guess, could you help sort of demystify some of these, threat actors and how their strategies and tactics have kind of evolved in the past few years?
There's a number of different strategies and approaches across the board, so it's not really a one-size-fits-all solution here. There's also different stages of maturity, and this was, I guess, the other key lesson for us as we were observing the events in Ukraine. There were certain things that we were anticipating would be markers of a very sophisticated actor, and I talk about this a lot. And a lot of those things had to do with the the big boom at the end of the cyber attack, like what the second stage payloads look like if we talk about things like the SANS ICS kill chain, and not so much what the access vectors look like, because there's still, even today, a lot of spear phishing. And not at all about what it meant to do targeting at a really professional level. The problem with that is if you're a historian of the data and you look at what has occurred in the past, there's a lot of examples of groups excelling in one of those domains, but not necessarily all three of them. So you have to be cognizant of the fact that there are different approaches that are undertaken by the different groups based on their various skill sets and ultimately where they want to be at the end of the day. A perfect example, my favorite APT, you're not supposed to have a favorite, but the one that I think didn't get enough play, wasn't picked up in the news at the time to the degree that I think it should have been, was a lot of the Dragonfly activity and the Havocs activity that occurred in the US circa 2013.
I guess with a somewhat of an educated guess, if you could give us a bit of an idea in terms of how you sort of project those attacks and potential defense, looking like and developing going forward.
Sure. Well, I think the first thing I'll say is I kind of made a career on predicting the future, at least forecasting the next steps. And what I will say is there's often indicators of what the next move will be if you know how to read it. That being said, you do have to be comfortable with being wrong because you're not right all the time. But one of the things that I kind of emphasize whenever I'm talking to new analysts and whenever I'm trying to give trainings or speak about how to do some of that forward-leaning analysis is it's really important to watch the market trends because that's what the adversaries are doing as well. And so there's certain things that we've seen over time, over the last 15 or 20 years, that have not just served as a basis to predict logically where we think the adversary is going to go, but they also dictate where the adversary has to go. Things like the relative shrinking of the operational technology market. So when we first started talking about automation adoption across and digitalization across multiple sectors, there were a lot more potential vendors for a lot of these components, hardware and software, and for a lot of these services. But as that has really compressed, as there's been a shrinking of the market space and there's been a lot of acquisitions, in many cases, you're talking about a few companies that are responsible for the vast majority of operations or technology that's deployed in critical infrastructure. So when we talk about what does that mean on the targeting side, what does it mean for the adversary? It doesn't require you to be a very competent targeter to realize that there are 6 or 7 vendors in the space, and you should probably have access or try to gain access into each one of their environments. Or if those technologies are being deployed as PLCs, programmable logic controllers, in 90% of the industry, then maybe you should also consider developing capabilities or looking for vulnerabilities against those devices. So that's kind of the first general thrust, I would say, is people should be cognizant of people should be aware of how the technology is shifting and how that will also shift the adversary. That's, I guess, takes me back to one of the key lessons I learned at Idaho National Laboratory, which is just because I may disagree with a particular focus of the industry or where it's going doesn't mean that anybody will necessarily listen to me. There are other factors at play besides just security. And in fact, in most cases, security is not the impetus or the incentive for why organizations are going a certain way. So you have to recognize those market dynamics. And I mean, frankly, just accept them as reality and go from there.
Plenty of development going on, and obviously something, these topics are something that we'll be able to explore further at the OT Cyber Resilience Summit with your keynote there. But thank you so much for joining us today there, Sarah, and obviously looking forward to seeing your presentation at the OT Cyber Resilience Summit.
Thanks so much for having me. Lots more to talk about for sure.